The NFL season starts in a couple of days, so in today's video, let's go ahead and hand out every single team's ceiling and floor for the upcoming 2024 season. So as I mentioned, we're going to be doing the ceiling and floor for every single NFL team. We're going to be doing this by division, so we'll start off with the AFC East, go through all the AFC, then talk about the NFC divisions. For each division, I will have timestamps on the timeline, so in case you want to check out your favorite division, you can just check out the timestamps. And for the sake of the video, I will not be including any sort of injuries when I'm taking into consideration these ceilings and floors. Without further ado, let's get into it. So as I mentioned, we're going to be starting off with the AFC East, and for each team, I'll try to give you guys a brief description, but I don't want to give you guys too much analysis or else the video will be like 30 or 40 minutes long. Starting off with the Buffalo Bills, for their ceiling, I have them at 13-4, but I think their floor is 9-8. My reasoning behind this is everything goes right if the receivers start playing at a high level. If the defense can patch up all the holes they had this offseason, this team could easily be one of the best teams in the league as long as Josh Allen is healthy. But hypothetically speaking, if we do see some regression within the offense because of the receiving core and some potential regression from the defense, this team could take a slight step back, but they still have Josh Allen. For the Miami Dolphins, I have their ceiling at 12-5, and I have their floor also as 9-8. A lot of the same principles for the Bills apply to the Dolphins. I think as long as the offense is as good as it has been the past couple years, they're easily one of the better teams in the AFC. But if the offense takes a step back, especially because of the offensive line, I don't really know how I feel about this team, and I could easily see them losing to a bunch of really good teams. After them, we have the New England Patriots. This is probably the worst team in the division, so their ceiling is 6-11 and their floor is 3-14. If this team were to somehow reach a higher win total than 6-11, my assumption is that Drake May comes in and plays like a superstar, but because I don't see that happening, especially because he's not starting week 1, I think this team is likely to fall somewhere between 6-11 to 3-14, which honestly isn't a bad thing. This is a rebuilding team that needs to take time to develop its young players while also going out there and drafting some really good players in next year and in future drafts. And lastly, for the AFC East, we have the New York Jets. For their ceiling, I had them at 13-4, and for their floor, I had them at 8-9. When I think about this Jets team, I really think about how dominant this defense is going to be next year, and with that defense, that's really going to allow them to be one of the best teams out there. But hypothetically speaking, if the offense underperforms based off of expectations, there is a possibility that this team doesn't quite reach the expectations that we do have on them. With that said, I think if Aaron Rodgers looks like the normal Aaron Rodgers we know him to be, this is going to be an awesome team in 2024. But next up, let's go ahead and talk about the AFC North, arguably the best division in the entire NFL. We will begin with the Baltimore Ravens and end with the Steelers. Starting off with the Ravens, I have their ceiling at 14-3 and their floor at 10-7. I think this team is likely going to be one of the best teams in the NFL next year. In fact, I have a video coming out hopefully tomorrow that will show off and represent why I think the Ravens are one of the best teams. But for this team, as long as you have the MVP-like guy on Lamar Jackson, you're going to be one of the best teams, as we saw like they were last year. But hypothetically speaking, let's say the defense takes a slight step back because of some of the losses they had in the offseason, and let's say the offensive line does present to be a bigger problem, then I can see this team performing a little bit less than what their expectations are. But with that all said, as long as you have a healthy Lamar Jackson, I think you're easily one of the best teams in the NFL, so I have them at that. Next up, we have the Cincinnati Bengals. I have their ceiling at 13-4 and their floor at 10-7. This is a team that, as long as they stay healthy, they're easily one of the better teams in the NFL. Heck, they're one of the only teams, not named Kansas City, that has actually made it to a Super Bowl within the last 5 years. So I do think we have to give them the respect they do deserve because of what they've done in the past. If Joe Burrow plays like Joe Burrow, and if they can get this Jamar Chase situation figured out, they are easily one of the best teams in the NFL. Let's move on now to the Cleveland Browns, who I have as their ceiling as 13-4 and their floor as 9-8. This is a weird team. They have a tough schedule, and I just do not believe in Deshaun Watson. With that all said, though, they do have a championship level team. I just don't know how I feel about the quarterback position. If the quarterback spot proves to be a point of strength, this can be maybe the best team in the NFL, but if it proves to be lackluster or bad, I think 9-8 is fairly realistic. And the last team in the AFC North we'll be talking about is the Pittsburgh Steelers. I have their ceiling as 11-6 and I have their floor as 7-10. Very tough schedule, but a dang good team. They're pretty similar to Cleveland in a lot of ways, but I do think their roster is a tad bit worse. And when it comes down to the quarterback situation, I believe so much more in Deshaun Watson than I do in Russell Wilson or Justin Fields at this point based off everything that I've seen. So because of that, that, I think if Russell Wilson works out for them, they're going to be a good team, but not like a great team, like a borderline playoff type of roster. But if Russ does struggle, then they're probably going to be like a 7 or 8 win team. And I know what everyone's saying, well, Metro, they went like 10-7 with Kenny Pickett, but this is a better division and it's a better conference and their schedule is pretty brutal. So that's why I have them as their floor as 7-10. Let's now move on to the AFC South, a division that I think very highly of. For the Houston Texans, I think they're going to easily be one of the best teams in the NFL. I have their ceiling as 13-4 and their floor as 9-8. Assuming that all the new pieces can come in and acclimate at a very high level and all mesh well together, this is easily one of the better teams in the NFL. But hypothetically speaking, if this team maybe has a little bit too high of expectations, and let's just say that Stephon Diggs does not work out with all the other pieces, and who knows, maybe the defense underperforms, then maybe 9-8, but I don't think that's very realistic. Then you have the Indianapolis Colts, a team that I think is a little bit underrated. I think their ceiling is 12-5, but I think their floor is 8-9. With Shane Steichen, I think this offense could be absolutely awesome in 2024. The only concern I have is how good can that defense actually be? As long as this team can stay healthy, I think they'll easily be able to compete for the division, but I still have a couple question marks about the roster. With that said, if Anthony plays like a high-level quarterback, this team can win 12 games, but if he performs like a rookie quarterback, then I think 8-9, 10-7, something along those lines is pretty realistic. Next up, the Jacksonville Jaguars, a team that I am a little bit higher on as we get closer to this season. I have their ceiling as 11-6 and I have their floor as 8-9. And I think for this team to take that big step forward, you're going to have to see Trevor Lawrence play like an MVP level quarterback. If he can do so, then I think this team could easily win over 10 games. But if we saw the Trevor that we saw late into last year, I definitely do have a bunch of concerns. But based off everything that I've been reading and everything that I've been seeing, Trevor's been performing very well in the offseason and in the preseason, so I'm very excited to see what this team can do. And last up for the AFC South is the Tennessee Titans, a team that can either be awesome or really bad. There's really no in between. I think this team is going to be super mysterious to watch the entire year. With that said, though, I have their ceiling as 10-7 and I have their floor as 6-11. This really all comes down to Will Levis and if the team can mesh well together, because if they can, on paper, it's a great roster. It just really comes down to the quarterback position. And given the fact that I am a big believer in Will Levis, I think this team can be pretty darn good next year. But let's talk about the last division in the AFC West, arguably the worst division in the NFL. It is super top heavy. But regardless, there are some interesting teams here. Starting off with the Denver Broncos, I have their ceiling as 8-9 and I have their floor as 4-13. This is a team that is just really in a rebuilding phase right now. They have some good pieces, don't get me wrong, and I think some underrated pieces at that. But in comparison to the rest of the NFL, I just don't see where this team is heading in 2024. With that said, though, this is the year off of Russell Wilson. You can kind of rebuild your roster to Sean Payton's liking, so this is going to be a fun year, especially if Bo Nix proves to be good, then that could make things a little bit more interesting. Then after them, I have the back-to-back champions, the Kansas City Chiefs, the team that I think should be the favorite to win a third championship in a row. I have their ceiling as 15-2, but I have their floor as 11-6. I think realistically speaking, you're going to see a Chiefs team that doesn't really care too much about the regular season yet again, which they've proven that they don't really have to worry about it that much. They can win on the road, they can win at home, it doesn't really matter. I just think that relatively speaking, they could, if they wanted to, win every game that they wanted to win, but because it's a team that doesn't really care about the regular season, I think they could potentially win like 11 games and be totally fine come playoff time. Then you have the Las Vegas Raiders, a team that obviously, as you guys know, I'm a massive fan of, but I gotta be realistic. Their ceiling is 10-7, their floor is 7-10. This is a team that I think will be very mid next year, like they've been the past couple years. I don't like the quarterback room, but I like a lot of the roster. It just really comes down to the fact that I don't believe in Gardner Minshew, nor Aiden O'Connell. And then lastly, to complete the AFC West, we have the LA Chargers, a team that I think is a little similar to Las Vegas, but they definitely have a little bit more potential. For this team, I have their ceiling as 10-7, and for their floor, I have them at 6-11. I think the Raiders as a pure roster have a better roster. But for me, I think they have the better coach and I think they have the better quarterback, which does allow them the potential to be a better team than Las Vegas. But for the case of the Chargers, let's just hypothetically say the run game isn't as good as you think it might be, and let's just say the receivers really do prove to be a problem, then that could make this Chargers team a really bad team, let's just be honest. But I think as long as you have Justin Herbert healthy and playing upright behind a pretty good offensive line, you should be okay. And I think as long as the receivers don't sell like Kadarius Toney, this is going to be a fine team that should be able to win a lot of big time matchups against some good to bad teams. But that completes the AFC. Let's now move on to the NFC, and we are going to begin with the NFC East. Starting off with the Dallas Cowboys, I think their ceiling is 13-4, but I think their floor is 9-8. I know this team has won back-to-back 12-5 seasons, but I think we have to give them a little bit extra cushion because I do believe the roster is really good. But because this has been an offseason of complete inactivity, you have to at least lower the floor a tad bit for them. I think more than likely they'll be a 12, 11, 10 win team as long as Dak, CD, and Micah stay healthy. But hypothetically speaking, if the issues they had in the offseason of not bringing anybody in does come in and does kind of hurt their season, 9-8 is a pretty realistic option. But with that said, let's then move on to the New York Giants, who I have their ceiling as 7-10 and their floor as 3-14. If you've watched my recent content, you would know that I'm very low on this Giants team. I don't think they're a good team at all, but there are some good pieces such as a Malik Neighbors. That defensive line and linebacking core is stout, and Deonte Banks is really good as well. That all said, the receiving core outside of Malik Neighbors is still very unproven. Even Neighbors to an extent is unproven, and it's Daniel Jones. That's really the crux of the situation for the Giants. Daniel Jones is going to hold back that team because I don't think he's a good quarterback whatsoever. So for the case of the Giants, if they can reach their ceiling of 7-10, then I think that's great, but I think more than likely they'll reach their floor of like 3-14, maybe 4-13 if some things go their way. Next up is the Philadelphia Eagles. For their ceiling, I have them at 15-2, but I have their floor as 9-8. This is probably the widest one of the entire video because I could see a world where this Eagles team is absolutely dominant next year because of all of their pure talent, their quarterback, their coaches, their offensive line, the defense was really talented. I can see that being a real possibility, but I can also see a world where all of that I just said doesn't pan out the way that we think it can, because last year was a real big disappointment. The coaching staff is a little bit suspect, a little unproven. I did not like the Kellen Moore signing, but I regress. And then when you look at the defense, there are still a couple holes in the linebacking and some unproven secondary members, but I think this team is much improved. You brought in Saquon, the offensive line is still good. I think this team has the potential to be great or kind of bad, weirdly enough. Then lastly, for the NFC East, we have the Washington Commanders. For this team, I think their ceiling is 9-8, but I think their floor is like 3-14. Now for Washington, they actually have a bit of a favorable schedule, which does work in their direction. Now for this Commanders team, their schedule is actually somewhat favorable, which definitely does help this take of them potentially being close to a 10-win team. But ultimately, when you're bringing in a bunch of new players and you just have a brand new, fresh new head coach and you have a young rookie quarterback, that does bring up a lot of question marks about how good the continuity of this team is going to be. What's the chemistry like? Will the players mesh well? Especially when you look at this team and look at all of their holes in their roster. The secondary isn't great. They don't really have a dominant edge rusher. Their linebackers, outside of Frankie Louvu, a little suspect, and the offensive line still has a number of issues. So with that said, I think they're a good enough team to be decent next year, but I wouldn't be shocked if they were not great. Next up, let's move on to the NFC North, a division that I think at one point had a conversation to be the best division, but after the McCarthy injury, probably not. But regardless, for the Chicago Bears, I think their ceiling is 11-6, but I think their floor is the opposite. I think it's 6-11. For this team to ultimately reach their ceiling, they're going to need an outstanding year from Caleb Williams as well as some other young players. But I will say, I think this team has the potential and talent to actually get there. Defensively speaking, they have the pieces, they have the coach, and I think if everything goes well, that could be a top 10 defense. Offensively, there are some question marks with the offensive line, which does bring them back a little bit, but you have some really good weapons, and as long as Caleb performs up to relative expectations, this is going to be a good team next year. Then after them, you have the Detroit Lions, a team that I am extremely high on heading into this upcoming year. For the Lions, I have their ceiling as 14-3, but I have their floor as 10-7. I think this team is going to be really good next year. It's just a matter of how good are they actually going to be. For this team, I do expect some progression from guys like Amon-Ra, their tight end, their Penei Sewell, their Jahmyr Gibbs, and a number of players defensively, so that I think that this team could allow themselves to take that big step forward. They also fixed up some issues on the defense, such as the secondary and interior defensive line, and I look at this team and think that they are really close to being a complete complete roster. The only thing that could potentially hold them back this year is maybe having too high of expectations, but I think that's a pretty good thing to have as maybe your only flaw. Then after them, you have the Green Bay Packers, a team that I do think will be able to contend for the NFC North as well as potentially the NFC in general. For their ceiling, I have their ceiling at 12-5, and for their floor, I have it at 8-9. This is a team that has a pretty tough schedule, as does basically every team in the NFL. And I'm banking on Jordan Love really taking a big step forward this year. If Jordan Love plays like a maybe top 10, top 8-ish quarterback, then man, this team could be really good because the roster in general is really awesome. I believe in the coaching staff. Yes, it's not a perfect team. I still think this team has a couple issues. But generally speaking, if Love plays like a top 10 quarterback, which I think is a definite possibility, then this team has a really high ceiling to be a really good team. And lastly, and unfortunately, it's the Minnesota Vikings. I say unfortunately because I have a hard time talking about this team because they looked like they were going to have a really good season, but it's just crumbling down on them. Even though they've made a couple moves, I just don't know how I feel about this team. I think their ceiling is 10-7, but I think their floor is 7-10. If Darnold really does work out and he's able to feed the ball to Jefferson and Addison, and let's say the offensive line and run game holds up, then great. That's maybe a 10-win team that maybe slips into the wild card. But I think more realistically speaking, they're going to be kind of similar to how they were last year. I do expect them to take a step forward, but there's just too many question marks surrounding Sam Darnold, so I don't really know how good this team can be. That's just the truth. But let's go ahead and move on to the NFC South, probably the worst division in the league. That's just me being honest. But we'll begin with, in my opinion, the best team, the Atlanta Falcons. I think their ceiling is 12-5, but I think their floor is 7-10. This is a team that either can be a really good team or a mediocre team, let's just be honest. Now, for this team to actually reach their ceiling and be a good team, Kirk Cousins has to, 1, stay healthy, but 2, play like a top 15, top 20-ish quarterback. And I think the rest of the roster is really going to work out for him. They have some good weapons, a good offensive line, good running backs, a good head coach, a good offensive coordinator, and I think the defense is improving drastically. So if everything does work out, I think they could easily be a lock for the playoffs and one of the best teams in the NFL. But let's say Kirk Cousins doesn't come back and play at a high level, and let's say the defense isn't really working at a high level, especially early on, then that could maybe lead this team to being a little bit mediocre. Then next up is the Carolina Panthers, a team that I expect to take a big step forward, but not a massive one. I have their ceiling at 7-10, but their floor at 2-15. Because I believe in Bryce Young and because I believe in Dave Canales, I'm a little bit more tempted to raise their ceiling a little bit higher, but realistically speaking, they'll likely win like 6 or 5 games, which is not a bad amount of wins based off of what happened last year. Obviously, I expect Bryce Young to look a lot better in year 2, and I think if he does that, then I would believe that this Panthers team is heading a bit more in the right direction after what was a bad year last year. Next up, the New Orleans Saints. In my opinion, I think they are the epitome of mediocre in the NFL, but I digress. Their ceiling is 10-7 and their floor is 7-10. For this team to be a good team next year, you're going to have to see this offense really become super creative, and it's just tough because I just don't really see a world where they can be a good team, but I think they'll be good enough. I look at the overall team and I look at the defense and I look at some of the pieces offensively, and I think it's a good team. It's just not a great team, or really a team that's heading in a specific direction. Like, they're not a team that's seriously contending in the playoffs, but they're also a team that's not seriously competing for like the #1 overall pick. You have a mediocre quarterback who's getting paid a lot. You have a mediocre head coach. Just don't really see what the direction for this team is. So that's why I think they're going to have a pretty mediocre record next year. But next up, let's talk about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the team that won the division last year. And I don't think they'll do it again, but I do think they're pretty similar to how they were last year. If Baker Mayfield plays like a top 20 quarterback like he did last year, this team should be pretty solid. I like the defense. I like the offense. Not a bunch of big complaints, but also not a lot of room for being a great team. So with that said, let's say Atlanta does stumble a little bit during the season, then I could definitely see a team like the Buccaneers potentially taking their spot to maybe win the division yet again. And lastly, the last division of the video is the AFC West. Let's start off with the Arizona Cardinals, who I think their ceiling is 9-8, but I believe their floor is 6-11. My belief for this team really does stem from the fact that I think this offense could arguably be like top 15 if Kyler 1 stays healthy, but also performs like a really good quarterback. So if he is able to do both of those things, then I do think this team team could maybe reach their ceiling. I think a bit more of a realistic goal is like 7-10 because I just don't think the defense is all that great. But I could definitely see a world where Kyler Murray does carry this team to being at least a good team. Next up is the LA Rams. I think their ceiling is 13-3, but I believe their floor is 9-8. This is one of the more loaded teams in the NFL. You got a quarterback that's been to a championship, has already won a championship, a winning Super Bowl head coach, a Super Bowl caliber roster. Defensively, some question marks, but I think this offense could be absolutely electric in 2024. So if, hypothetically speaking, they can reach that level of potential based off of their offense, I think this team could be really good next year, and I think that there's a lot of good things heading for this team long term. Next, we're going to talk about the San Francisco 49ers, the team that represented the NFC in last year's Super Bowl. A loaded roster. They just got the Ayuk situation dealt with. I'm imagining they'll get the Trent Williams one done as well here soon. So with that said, I think their ceiling is 15-2, but I think their floor is 11-6. For them to reach their ceiling, they're going to obviously need a lot of similar things that happened last year to yet again happen in 2024. I do think the team is basically a better version of what they were last year, but I think the rest of the NFC and the NFL in general is a lot better, so maybe that does bring a team like San Francisco down a little bit. I still think they're probably the second or maybe the first best team in the entire NFC. And lastly, to end the video, we'll be talking about the Seattle Seahawks. I think their ceiling is 12-5, but I believe their floor is 7-10. The reason for the large disparity is just simply because of how good the rest of the NFL is. And honestly, you could take that same sort of idea on basically every team on this list. The NFL's gotten a lot better, and I think Seattle has as well, but I'm just not sure how much better they actually got in comparison to the rest of the league. Offensively, you're still rocking with essentially the same team. Some new pieces on the offensive line, but I still think the line is a little bit bad in certain ways. But I do think with everything that's bad about the offensive line, everything else around it is really freaking good. And then defensively, I do expect them to take a big step forward with their new defensive coordinator, with their new head coach, and their new pieces. So I do expect there to be some progression there as well. But as of right now, I think a little bit more realistically, I think 10-7, 11-6 is a bit more realistic. So I think that's where they'll likely hit in 2024. But you guys tell me, do you guys agree or disagree with all the picks I made in the video? And if you disagree, let me know in the comment section below. And I love you guys. Peace.